Who was Danelo Cavalcante? Before he became the center of one of America's largest manhunts, Danelo Cavalcante was living a life that attracted very little attention. Born in Brazil, Cavalcante spent most of his early years there, before eventually making his way to the United States. Like many people seeking a new life, he settled in Pennsylvania, hoping to build a future for himself. To his neighbors, he appeared to be just another resident trying to get by. But behind that ordinary appearance was a man with a violent past. Long before his name appeared on national news, Brazilian authorities had already accused Cavalcante of involvement in a homicide in his home country. Before that case could be resolved, he left Brazil and eventually settled in the United States. For years, he managed to stay out of the national spotlight. No one could have imagined that he would one day become the target of an operation involving hundreds of police officers, helicopters, drones, K-9 units, and federal agents. Everything changed in 2021. A relationship that had once seemed ordinary suddenly took a tragic turn. What happened next would not only end one person's life, it would completely change Danelo Cavalcante's future. And within just a few years, his name would be known across the entire United States. Not because of the crime itself, but because of a prison escape that many believed should have been impossible. Everything changed on April 18th, 2021. That evening, police responded to a quiet residential neighborhood in Schuylkill Township, Pennsylvania, after receiving reports of a violent incident. When officers arrived, they discovered 33-year-old Deborah Brando suffering from multiple stab wounds in the front yard of her home. Despite the efforts of emergency responders, she died at the scene. Investigators quickly identified the suspect as her former boyfriend, Danelo Cavalcante. According to prosecutors, Brando had recently ended their relationship and was preparing to move on with her life. Authorities allege that Cavalcante confronted her outside her home, where the argument turned violent. After the attack, he fled the area before police arrived. A large search operation was launched almost immediately. For several days, investigators followed leads, interviewed witnesses, and searched for Cavalcante across the region. Eventually, he was located in Virginia after contacting people he knew. He was arrested without incident and returned to Pennsylvania to face trial. As investigators continued building their case, prosecutors argued that the killing had been intentional and supported by strong physical and forensic evidence. Cavalcante pleaded not guilty, but the evidence presented in court would ultimately determine his future. The trial was about to begin. The trial. In the summer of 2023, Danelo Cavalcante stood trial for the murder of Deborah Brando. Over the course of several days, prosecutors presented witness testimony, forensic evidence, and surveillance footage that they argued proved Cavalcante was responsible for the killing. The prosecution claimed that the attack had been deliberate and that Cavalcante fled the scene immediately afterward in an attempt to avoid capture. The defense challenged parts of the prosecution's case, but the evidence presented in court proved difficult to overcome. After hearing the testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Danelo Cavalcante was found guilty of first-degree murder. For the victim's family, the verdict brought a sense of justice after more than 2 years of waiting. For Cavalcante, It marked the beginning of what everyone believed would be the rest of his life behind bars. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. With no chance of release, Cavalcante was transferred to the Chester County Prison in Pennsylvania to await his transfer to a state correctional facility. To prison officials, he was simply another convicted murderer, a dangerous inmate, but one who was finally behind bars. No one inside the prison could have imagined what would happen just days later. Because on the morning of August 31st, 2023, Danelo Cavalcante was about to accomplish something that seemed impossible. The morning of August 31st, 2023, began like any other day inside Chester County Prison. Correctional officers followed their daily routines, while inmates were escorted to the prison's exercise yard. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing appeared out of place. But one inmate had been studying the prison's layout for days. That inmate was Danelo Cavalcante. As surveillance cameras recorded every movement, Cavalcante walked calmly into the exercise yard with the other inmates. Then, he made his move. Instead of remaining in the yard, he approached a narrow gap between two prison walls. What happened next stunned investigators. Using only his hands and feet, Cavalcante pressed himself between the walls and began climbing upward. Foot by foot, he inched his way toward the roof using a technique sometimes referred to as chimney climbing. Within seconds, he had reached the top of the building. He then climbed over razor wire, crossed the prison rooftop, and disappeared from sight. The entire escape lasted only a matter of minutes, yet no correctional officer stopped him. Even more surprising, his escape wasn't discovered immediately. For nearly an hour, no one realized that a convicted murderer had climbed out of the prison and vanished. By the time prison officials noticed he was missing, Danelo Cavalcante was already gone. What had just happened would soon become one of the most embarrassing prison escapes in recent American history. Within hours, hundreds of law enforcement officers would begin searching for a man who had escaped in a way that many believed was impossible.
The manhunt begins. As soon as prison officials confirmed that Danelo Cavalcante had escaped, an emergency response was launched across southeastern Pennsylvania. Within minutes, the prison was placed on lockdown. Roads surrounding the facility were blocked, and officers searched every nearby building, hoping he was still somewhere inside the prison grounds. But it was already too late. Cavalcante had disappeared. The Pennsylvania State Police quickly took command of the operation. Soon they were joined by the FBI, the U.S. Marshals Service, local police departments, SWAT teams, and dozens of other law enforcement agencies. Authorities warned residents that Cavalcante should be considered extremely dangerous. Schools in the surrounding communities were temporarily closed. People were advised to stay inside their homes, lock their doors, and report any suspicious activity immediately. As the search expanded, helicopters filled the skies above Chester County. Drones equipped with thermal cameras searched the dense woodlands below. K-9 tracking teams followed every possible trail, while heavily armed officers searched abandoned buildings, farms, and miles of forest. Despite the enormous law enforcement presence, there was still no sign of Danelo Cavalcante. Days passed without a confirmed sighting. Then investigators began receiving reports that someone had been stealing food, clothing, and supplies from nearby homes. The evidence suggested that Cavalcante was still hiding in the area, and that he was becoming more desperate with each passing day. The manhunt was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. Life on the run. As the days passed, the search for Danelo Cavalcante grew even larger. Hundreds of officers continued searching around the clock, but Cavalcante remained one step ahead. According to investigators, he survived by moving through dense forests and avoiding populated areas whenever possible. Authorities later said he entered several properties during the manhunt. Food disappeared from homes. Clothing and supplies were reported stolen. In one case, security cameras captured a figure believed to be Cavalcante walking through a residential area in the middle of the night. Each new sighting gave investigators hope, but every time officers arrived, he was already gone. The manhunt had now entered its second week. Law enforcement expanded the search perimeter even further. Additional tactical teams were deployed. Helicopters continued flying overhead. Thermal drones searched through the trees every night. Investigators believed Cavalcante was becoming increasingly desperate. They expected that sooner or later, he would make a mistake, and that mistake would finally bring the manhunt to an end. The capture. In the early hours of September 13th, 2023, after nearly 2 weeks on the run, investigators finally received the breakthrough they had been waiting for. A surveillance aircraft equipped with thermal imaging detected a heat signature deep inside a wooded area near South Coventry Township. The information was immediately relayed to officers on the ground. Within minutes, tactical teams quietly surrounded the area. K-9 units were brought in to track the suspect's exact location. As officers moved through the dense woods, they spotted a figure hiding among the trees. It was Danelo Cavalcante. Realizing he had been found, Cavalcante attempted to escape one last time. But there was nowhere left to run. A police dog was released and successfully stopped him before he could disappear back into the forest. Moments later, heavily armed officers moved in and took Cavalcante into custody. According to authorities, he was carrying a stolen rifle at the time of his arrest. Fortunately, no shots were fired during the operation. After 13 days on the run, one of the largest manhunts in Pennsylvania's history had finally come to an end. For the hundreds of officers who had spent nearly 2 weeks searching forests, fields, and neighborhoods, the mission was finally over. But for investigators, another question still remained. How had a convicted murderer managed to escape from a prison that was supposed to be secure in the first place? The aftermath. Although Danelo Cavalcante was back behind bars, the story was far from over. His escape quickly became the focus of multiple investigations. How could a convicted murderer escape from a county prison in broad daylight? Why wasn't he stopped? And why did it take so long for prison staff to realize he was missing? Investigators soon discovered that this was not the first time an inmate had escaped using the exact same climbing technique. Just a few months earlier, another prisoner had managed to climb between the same two walls and escape from the very same exercise yard. Following that incident, prison officials had been advised to improve security and install additional barriers. Those recommendations, however, had not yet been fully implemented. As a result, Cavalcante exploited the very same weakness. The investigation also revealed that the correctional officer assigned to monitor the exercise yard failed to notice the escape as it happened. Authorities later stated that the officer had been distracted and did not immediately report what had occurred. Following the investigation, several prison employees faced disciplinary action, and the prison's security procedures were thoroughly reviewed. New physical barriers were installed, surveillance practices were updated, and additional measures were introduced to prevent a similar escape from ever happening again. As for Danelo Cavalcante, he was transferred to a maximum security state correctional facility, where officials said he would remain under far stricter supervision. His 13 days of freedom had come to an end. But the questions surrounding one of America's most embarrassing prison escapes would continue long after his capture.